In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the English Channel was covered in a cold mist that hid one of the largest armadas in history. Thousands of ships moved steadily toward the coast of Normandy. Among them were the landing craft of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, carrying men, supplies, and several tanks of the 70th Tank Battalion. These were Sherman M4s, the main workhorses of the American armored force. Each Sherman carried a 5-man crew and an engine that had already endured months of training in the damp English countryside. The tanks were not new. Many had been shipped from American factories in 1942 and 1943, and their engines were tired. Salt air had corroded fittings, filters were worn, and the tight schedules of the invasion left little time for repairs. In the motor pool near the embarkation point at Torquay, a mechanic named Staff Sergeant Robert "Bob" Kinney worked through the night before the invasion. Kinney was responsible for keeping the tanks of Company B running. He had been a farm equipment mechanic before the war, used to fixing tractors and plows with whatever was at hand. In the Army, that habit of improvisation often clashed with regulations. Official maintenance manuals told mechanics to replace, not repair, damaged parts. But in the weeks before D-Day, replacements were scarce. 2 of Company B's Shermans had developed the same problem: rough idling and oil loss during long operation. Their engines, Continental R-975 radial aircraft engines adapted for tank use, were notorious for overheating when pushed too hard. The problem was in the cylinder cooling baffles, thin metal plates that directed air over the cylinders. Several were cracked or missing entirely. Without them, the engine's temperature spiked within minutes, risking seizure under heavy load. The manual solution was to replace the entire assembly, but the spare parts warehouse near Torquay was empty. Kinney knew that if those 2 tanks couldn't move off the landing craft, the infantry they were assigned to support would be without armored cover on Utah Beach. He tried the official channels, requisition forms, supply sergeants, phone calls, but the response was always the same: no parts, no time. At around midnight, Kinney made a decision that would later be described by his commanding officer as crazy. He would build new baffles from scrap metal using pieces scavenged from wrecked jeeps and broken field stoves. Working under the dim light of a blackout lamp, he and 2 assistants began shaping curved metal guides by hand. They used a field anvil, a hammer, and the rim of a jeep wheel to bend pieces into rough semicircles. It was crude work, but it might direct enough air to keep the engine from boiling. By 2 o'clock, the first set was ready. The makeshift parts were bolted into place with whatever hardware they could find, a mix of standard bolts and salvaged aircraft rivets. There was no time to test them properly. The tanks had to be loaded by dawn. Kinney warned the crews that it might not hold. They laughed, more out of exhaustion than confidence. For the men climbing into those Shermans, the thought of not landing was worse than the risk of breaking down on the beach. When the landing craft began their approach, the waves were already high. Water sprayed over the open decks, soaking the crews and their equipment. The engines were running constantly, idling hot to prevent stalling. Kinney's patched baffles rattled, but held. At 06:30, the first wave hit Utah Beach. The German defenses opened up immediately, artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire slashing across the surf. The Shermans rolled forward through the shallow water, their engines straining under load. One of the tanks, callsign Baker 1, took a near miss from a shell that cracked its transmission housing. The crew kept moving, the mechanics' fix still holding temperature steady despite the damage. The other, Baker 2, was less fortunate. A hidden sandbar forced it to stall as water entered the engine compartment. The crew thought it was finished, but when the driver hit the starter again, the engine caught after 2 turns. The makeshift cooling plates had prevented the vapor lock that usually killed flooded engines. The tank roared back to life and climbed the beach under fire. Later that morning, officers from the 70th Tank Battalion's maintenance section noted the 2 tanks' performance in their field log. Both had completed their objectives despite sustaining damage that normally would disable a Sherman. In the margins, someone wrote, "Kinney's Vix worked." That brief note might have been the end of it, but the story spread quickly. Mechanics from neighboring units began asking about the crazy engine patch that kept the Utah Beach tanks running. Kinney was told to explain what he'd done, and he described it simply: just made the air go where it needed to. By the evening of June 6th, as the first foothold in Normandy was secure, those two Shermans were still operational. Their engines were hot, battered, and leaking oil, but they were moving, and that made all the difference. Behind the front lines, mechanics began gathering around damaged tanks to study the improvised baffles. Some doubted it would hold up for long. Others immediately started copying it. Within days, small teams were welding similar makeshift cooling guides into any Sherman that showed signs of overheating. No one officially credited the idea. In the paperwork that followed, the modification was recorded as field-adapted airflow adjustment, but among the crews, it became known simply as Kinney's fix. As the Allied advance moved deeper into Normandy, tank battalions faced new problems: hedgerows, mines, and ambushes. Yet the issue of overheating never fully disappeared. In the summer heat, the crazy fix kept dozens of tanks in operation that might otherwise have been left behind. By June 10th, field reports from the 2nd Armored Division noted a sharp decline in engine failures, and several officers mentioned local cooling improvements made in bivouac. In reality, most of those improvements traced back to the night before D-Day, to a single mechanic's decision to ignore the manual and trust his hands instead. In the chaos of war, small acts of improvisation often made the difference between success and disaster. The story of Kinney's fix was one of those, a reminder that even the most advanced machines in the world could depend on a few scraps of metal, a steady hammer, and one man's refusal to give up. By the end of that first week in Normandy, the battered Shermans of the 70th Tank Battalion were still pushing forward. Their paint was burned, their hulls dented, and their engines roaring louder than ever. But inside, hidden beneath the armor, those rough, handmade cooling plates were still doing their job. And in the field workshops scattered behind the beachhead, other mechanics were now beginning to experiment too. Filing down bits of wreckage, testing airflows with paper strips, and finding their own ways to keep the engines alive for one more day. It was a lesson that would carry through the entire campaign. Sometimes, survival didn't come from orders or plans, but from the quiet ingenuity of a man with a wrench and an idea.
By June 12, 1944, the beaches were secure, but Normandy was far from won. The inland terrain was a maze of hedgerows, thick, earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that turned every field into a miniature fortress. The Sherman, designed for mobility on open ground, struggled in this kind of landscape. Its tracks caught roots, its hull scraped against the banks, and its engines strained in low gear for hours at a time. That week, the 70th Tank Battalion had moved south toward Carentan, a small but vital crossroads between Utah and Omaha beaches. The fight for Carentan was fierce. German paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment defended every hedge and farm building. The American infantry needed tank support just to move 50 yards forward. Inside those Shermans, Kinney's improvised cooling baffles were about to face their first true test under continuous combat load. The tanks crawled through thick mud and choking dust, engines roaring at near maximum temperature. Crews learned quickly that if a Sherman overheated in a hedgerow lane, it became a perfect target. Stopping to cool off meant dying in place. Kinney had stayed behind with the battalion's maintenance section, setting up a temporary repair yard near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The camp was a rough patch of open ground dotted with burned-out vehicles and piles of scrap. Day and night, he worked on damaged tanks brought back from the front, replacing cracked track links, welding armor plates, patching fuel lines shot through by small arms fire. Word of his crazy fix had already spread beyond his unit. Mechanics from the 746th Tank Battalion arrived asking for details. Kinney showed them how to cut the metal sheets into curved channels and bolt them around the cylinders. He warned them not to make them too tight. Airflow mattered more than symmetry. The men took notes on the back of ration boxes and left with armfuls of scrap metal to copy the design. Meanwhile, on the front line near Carentan, Baker 1 and Baker 2 were still in the fight. Their engines, patched and noisy, refused to quit. The crews had developed a habit of checking oil levels between engagements and tightening bolts after every march. They joked that if the engines ever gave out, they'd rather push the tanks themselves than give up on Kinney's handiwork. On June 15, during a German counterattack south of Carentan, Baker 1 became trapped in a narrow lane when a Panther tank opened fire from 600 yards away. The first shell missed by inches, throwing dirt and smoke across the road. The crew fired back, their 75mm gun clanging against the Panther's frontal armor. The fight lasted barely 2 minutes, ending when Allied artillery landed nearby and forced the Germans to withdraw. When the smoke cleared, Baker 1 was still running. The engine temperature gauge read dangerously high, but it hadn't boiled over. Later that night, the driver swore he'd seen the temperature needle rise, then drop suddenly, as if the cooling had caught up just in time. To him, it was proof that the fix wasn't luck, it worked. Kinney, still in the rear, received the report with disbelief. He had expected his patchwork baffles to last a few days at best, not through a full week of battle. But the reports kept coming. Tanks that should have overheated didn't. Engines that had been written off as unreliable kept running day after day. As the American advance pressed inland, the maintenance crews became as mobile as the combat units themselves. They followed the tanks in convoys of trucks carrying spare parts, welding kits, and fuel drums. In every new field depot, Kinney's name came up. Mechanics started calling the modification the farmer's fan, a joke referencing his background, but also an acknowledgement of how it kept the Shermans alive. By June 15, new orders came down from battalion headquarters. Maintenance teams were instructed to apply field airflow modification on all R-975 equipped tanks exhibiting overheating tendencies. It wasn't officially called the Kinney fix, but everyone knew where it came from. Each night, the sound of hammers and torches filled the repair yards. Mechanics cut up old armor skirts, Jeep fenders, and even ration tin lids to shape into crude airflow channels. The Army had turned a desperate improvisation into standard field practice. That same week, engineers from the Ordnance Department arrived in Normandy to inspect the condition of armored vehicles. They were surprised by the number of tanks still operational despite the heat and dust. One of them, Captain Howard Emerson, visited Kinney's workshop and asked to see the modification firsthand. Kinney explained it plainly. You just force the air where it's supposed to go. Doesn't need to be fancy. Emerson sketched the layout in his notebook and promised to report it to higher command. He did, though in his report he called it a field-initiated airflow correction method. There was no mention of who had started it. The battlefield didn't care about credit. What mattered was survival. In the hedgerow country, every extra hour of engine life meant one more push forward, one more chance for infantry to reach the next road or farmhouse. Tank crews became obsessed with keeping their engines cool. They carried spare oil cans, cleaned air filters by hand, and kept hatches open whenever possible. Mechanics worked under shell fire, sometimes lying half buried under tanks while swapping out fuel pumps or retightening bolts. By late June, the front was a patchwork of burning vehicles and stalled armor. German 88mm guns had taken a heavy toll. Still, the Shermans kept coming. Many of them carried the small, rough-edged metal plates that traced back to a single night in England. One evening, as Kinney finished another long shift, a replacement officer stopped by the workshop. He looked at the welded patches on the latest batch of tanks and asked, half joking, "Who keeps teaching these boys to break the rules?" Kinney didn't answer. He just wiped the grease from his hands and went back to work. Behind him, the sound of engines filled the dusk, the same engines that had carried the first wave onto Utah Beach and were now rolling toward St-Lo. Each one bore the marks of desperation and ingenuity, proof that sometimes what kept a machine alive wasn't perfection, but persistence. And as the campaign in Normandy dragged on, the crazy idea that had started in a dark English workshop would soon face its hardest challenge yet when the 70th Tank Battalion pushed into the bocage under fire so intense that even steel began to melt. By June 25th, the fields of Normandy were no longer green. Smoke, shell fire, and weeks of fighting had turned the hedgerows into a maze of craters, burned trees, and wrecked armor. The 70th Tank Battalion was now attached to the 4th Infantry Division's push toward St-Lo, a town that had already become a graveyard for tanks. Every advance cost machines and men. Every mile required engines that could hold under strain. In those conditions, the Shermans' biggest enemy wasn't just German fire, it was heat.
The radial engines designed for aircraft
were being forced to crawl through mud and debris at low speed where airflow was weakest. Inside the engine compartments, temperatures climbed past safe limits in minutes. Normally, that meant shutdowns, breakdowns, or even fires. But the tanks carrying Kinney's modification kept running. Crews began to notice something unusual. Tanks with the crazy baffles, as they called them, didn't just survive longer, they ran quieter at idle. The airflow seemed to clear more dust, reducing the choking effect that usually followed prolonged marches. Mechanics couldn't explain it. They only knew that something about the rough, uneven plates seemed to make the air swirl more effectively around the cylinders. One morning, outside the village of Méautis, Kinney's small maintenance convoy caught up with the front line. Baker, too, was there, scarred from hits, one side of its armor blackened by a glancing shell. The crew had managed to reach the edge of a field before the transmission jammed. When Kinney arrived, he crawled beneath the hull with his flashlight and found the gearbox cracked clean through. It should have been a total loss. But then he saw the engine gauges. Oil pressure still steady, temperature holding. The fix was still doing its job even in a tank that could barely move. The crew insisted on keeping the tank alive. They helped Kinney remove the damaged parts, scavenging bolts and plates from a nearby wreck. Working through the night under distant artillery flashes, they got the transmission to turn again. At dawn, Baker 2 moved, slowly, groaning, but it moved. For the infantry following behind, that single tank meant cover, and cover meant survival. By then, Kinney's small repair section had become famous in name, if not in person. Commanders across the sector were sending requests. Apply field cooling mod as per 70th Battalion practice. Even British units began experimenting with similar guides on their Cromwells. The idea had spread like rumor through every depot, carried by grease-stained notebooks and word of mouth. But the deeper the Allies pushed, the harder the fighting became. Saint-Lô was being bombarded by both sides. Roads vanished under rubble. Mechanics worked out of destroyed barns and roadside pits. Supplies arrived late, if at all. When spare oil ran out, they used captured German lubricant. When proper metal was gone, they cut armor skirts into strips. Every fix was a compromise, every repair a gamble. On June 30, the battalion faced its worst day since D-Day. During an attempt to flank German positions near Le Desert, several Shermans were hit in quick succession. One Sherman took a direct 88mm hit to the rear. The shell punched through the engine deck and ignited the fuel line. The crew bailed out, expecting the whole tank to explode. But instead of a firestorm, there was only heavy, black smoke. When Kinney arrived hours later, he realized why. The improvised baffles had slowed the spread of flames, trapping the heat long enough for the fire to suffocate itself. The engine was ruined, but the hull was intact. That tank would be rebuilt and fighting again within a week. As the month ended, the battlefield was filled with small miracles like that. Tanks that should have been dead were being revived in muddy fields, patched together with wire and welds. The official reports made no mention of heroics, only improved operational durability and reduced engine failures due to field innovation. But among the crews, the story had a name and a face. When Baker 1 finally rolled back into the maintenance area after 3 continuous weeks of fighting, Kinney was waiting. The crew climbed out filthy, exhausted, grinning. The driver, the same one who'd laughed at the fix back in Torquay, handed him a single twisted bolt. He said, "That's the only thing that came loose." Kinney kept the bolt. He didn't see it as proof of genius, only as evidence that sometimes doing things the wrong way was the only way that worked. The next phase of the campaign was already forming. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy hedgerows, would push every machine to its limit. For the 70th Tank Battalion, it would mean days of constant motion under dust, sun, and fire. And for Kinney, it meant the longest, hottest days those engines had ever faced. The Shermans were lined up nose to tail along narrow French roads, their crews sitting on the hulls and watching the skies. Dust clung to their uniforms, mixed with sweat and grime. Many of those tanks carried Kinney's airflow modification, some built by him, others by mechanics who had copied it. To anyone looking from the outside, they all looked like ordinary M4s. But underneath, in the hidden spaces around the engine block, there were pieces of Jeep metal, stove fragments, and ration tin baffles.
the quiet fingerprints of one man's desperation weeks earlier. Kinney was now running what amounted to a mobile factory. His section had been attached directly to the battalion's headquarters and moved wherever the tanks went. His small team, 4 mechanics and a driver, lived out of the converted half-track filled with welding gear, fuel drums, and boxes of salvaged metal. They slept in shifts, working through the night whenever damaged tanks limped in from the front. On the morning of July 25th, the breakout began. The bombardment was deafening, hundreds of Allied bombers dropping thousands of tons of explosives on German positions. The ground shook like an earthquake. The shockwaves cracked the glass in vehicles miles away. Kinney and his men crouched behind a low wall and waited for the order to advance. When the tanks finally moved, they rolled straight through clouds of dust so thick that drivers could barely see their own gun barrels. Visibility dropped to nothing. Engines roared at full throttle as the Shermans climbed over craters and wreckage. The heat inside each vehicle climbed above 120 degrees F. Men poured water on the floor plates just to keep their boots from burning. The first breakdowns came within hours. Not from Kinney's tanks, from others. The ones without his airflow fix began seizing up, the overheated cylinders locking solid. Some caught fire, others simply died in place. Crews bailed out, waving at the next tank to go around them. By noon, the difference was impossible to ignore. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel John J. Waters, sent word for Kinney. He wanted every tank under his command fitted with the modification. Kinney tried to explain there wasn't time, the advance was still underway, but Waters didn't care. Do it while we move, however you have to.
That day, Kinney's team became part of the moving column itself. They drove between tanks, welding and bolting parts, while shells whistled overhead. Sparks flew from the back of their half-track as they worked on running engines. It was chaos, and somehow, it worked. By the end of the day, 20 more Shermans had been modified in the field. That evening, after 16 hours of non-stop advance, the battalion halted near the village of Ebecrevon. The sky was dark with smoke, and the roads were littered with burned-out German half-tracks and Panthers. Kinney walked through the line of parked Shermans, checking engine bays one by one. Not a single one with his modification had overheated. The men inside were exhausted, their uniforms soaked through, but they were alive, and their machines still ran. Word spread again. Other battalions began requesting the field baffles. Engineers came from ordnance to inspect the results firsthand. One officer remarked that he hadn't seen a tank column move that far in a single day without a trail of broken-down machines behind it. Another, half smiling, told Kinney he should have patented it. Kinney only shook his head. "You can't patent luck," he said. The breakout continued. Over the next 3 days, the Allies finally broke free of the bocage. The fields opened up, and for the first time since landing in France, tank crews could see the horizon. They raced south toward Coutances, overrunning German positions that had no time to regroup. The speed of the advance shocked even the high command, and every mile pushed the engines harder. On July 28th, near the village of Comprend, Baker 1 and Baker 2 were ordered to spearhead a flanking maneuver against retreating German units. Both tanks had been running almost non-stop since Cobra began. Their paint was scorched, and the smell of burnt oil filled their interiors. But the engines, those patched-together improvised hearts, kept going. By the time they reached the far side of the village, their fuel was nearly gone. The crews dismounted, their faces blackened by smoke, and watched as the rest of the battalion thundered past. A correspondent traveling with the division later wrote in his notebook, "Two Shermans that refused to die. Even their engines seemed stubborn." That night, Kinney found them again, parked side by side in a ditch, both still idling softly under the stars. The sound was uneven, rough, but steady. The same sound he'd heard back in England when he wasn't even sure the things would start. He sat on one of the fenders and listened for a long time. By then, his name had already spread across the Corps. He didn't know it, but reports describing his modification had reached Ordnance headquarters in England. Engineers there were testing copies of his airflow plates in controlled conditions, comparing temperatures before and after. They found that the crude, curved design improved cooling by nearly 18%, more than any previous official modification. But for Kinney, the statistics didn't matter. What mattered were the men who came back in one piece because their tank hadn't quit halfway through a fight. As July ended and the Allied forces prepared to cross into Brittany, the crazy fix had become standard practice. Every new Sherman arriving from depots in Cherbourg carried factory-made versions of Kinney's airflow channels. Smoothed, measured, and painted. They worked perfectly, but they lacked the story. The men in the field knew where the idea came from. They knew it started with one sleepless mechanic, a few scraps of metal, and a night when the war couldn't wait for official parts. And soon, that same man would find himself standing beside the tanks he had saved, watching them roll into a battle that would decide whether all his work, all his stubborn faith in a crazy idea, had truly been worth it. Because the next fight wouldn't just test engines, it would test everything that kept them running: men, machines, and the fragile thread of ingenuity that tied them together. The next fight came faster than anyone expected. On August 2nd, 1944, the 70th Tank Battalion received orders to push toward the town of Avranches, a key junction that would open the road to Brittany. The Germans knew it too. They were throwing everything they had left into stopping the breakout, including the few remaining Panthers and Tiger tanks that had survived the bombing. By dawn, the sound of artillery rolled through the low hills. The column began to move again, tanks rumbling across broken roads, their tracks grinding over burned-out vehicles. Kinney's half-track followed close behind the lead platoon, the welding gear rattling in the back. His hands were raw, his eyes bloodshot from days without rest, but he refused to stop. The engines he'd modified weeks before were still running strong, and he meant to keep them that way. Near the outskirts of Avranches, the column came under fire. German anti-tank guns hidden in hedgerows opened up at close range. The first shell hit a Sherman 2 tanks ahead of Baker 1, punching straight through the side armor and setting the fuel alight. The crew bailed out, one man dragging another with a burned arm. Then came a second hit, a near miss that showered the road in dirt and steel fragments. The Shermans returned fire, their 75mm guns hammering back, each blast shaking the ground. Kinney and his men dove for cover beside their vehicle. He could see Baker 1 straining forward, its turret turning, the engine roaring under the extra weight of mud and debris. Flames flickered near the rear vents, oil splatter catching from the heat. He didn't think. He sprinted through the smoke, ducking as tracer rounds whipped overhead. The tank commander was shouting something he couldn't hear. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the side of the tank and sprayed it into the vent until the smoke thinned. The engine sputtered, coughed, then steadied again. He slammed the rear hatch shut and waved the crew to keep moving. The column pushed through yard by yard until the German line broke. When it was over, the road behind them was a wreck. Blackened vehicles, scattered equipment, and the bodies of men who hadn't made it. Kinney stood for a long time beside the 2 surviving Shermans, both scarred and dented but still running. One of the gunners climbed out and clapped him on the shoulder. "Still alive," he said, grinning through grime. "Guess your crazy fix works after all." That night, they set up camp just outside Avranches. For the first time in weeks, the men allowed themselves to believe the worst might be behind them. Kinney sat with his back against a fuel drum, listening to the low idle of engines across the field. The sound was steady and even, like a heartbeat. Somewhere nearby, someone was frying canned meat on a stove made from a shell casing. The air smelled like oil, smoke, and rain. By morning, the news spread. Avranches was secure. The breakout had succeeded.
American armor was pouring through the gap into Brittany and beyond. General Patton's Third Army was moving at full speed, and the 70th was right in the thick of it. In the days that followed, Kinney's name became something of a legend within the armored divisions. Officers called his idea the Normandy baffle, though he always laughed at the name. Engineers from headquarters traced his design, copied it, and sent it up the chain of command. They even summoned him to a briefing tent one afternoon, not to reprimand him, but to thank him. A colonel handed him a citation for field ingenuity under fire. Kinney barely glanced at it. He just asked when he could get back to his tanks.
Weeks later, during the drive across France, the battalion paused in a field outside Le Mans. The grass was green again, and the sound of battle was miles away. Kinney climbed onto Baker 1 and opened the engine hatch. The metal inside was dull with dust, streaked with oil, but still whole. He ran his hand across the welded plates he'd added, those crude bits of tin and Jeep metal that had once seemed like madness. They were still holding. Nearby, another mechanic from a different unit walked over. "You the guy who started this?" he asked, pointing at the makeshift airflow plate. Kinney nodded. The man smiled. "Hell of a fix. We copied it on half our tanks. They don't quit anymore." Kinney didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the field, where the Shermans were lined up, their engines ticking quietly in the afternoon sun. For a moment, the war felt far away. Then a runner came down the line shouting new orders, and the spell broke. The tanks rumbled to life again, one by one, until the whole line was moving east. By the time they reached the Seine, Baker 1 and Baker 2 had traveled more than 400 miles since Normandy, without a single major failure. Both bore new layers of paint, field repairs, and the scars of near misses. The crews treated them like living things, patting their hulls before every battle, cursing them affectionately when they stalled. To the men inside, those tanks weren't just machines. They were survival made of steel and a little bit of one mechanic's madness. When the war finally moved beyond France and into Belgium, Kinney was reassigned to a rear maintenance depot. It wasn't glamorous work, no front lines, no explosions, just endless rows of tanks waiting for repair. But in every engine bay he opened, he saw the same small detail: a curved metal baffle welded just behind the intake fan. Sometimes it was clean and smooth. Sometimes it was rough, uneven, made from whatever the crew could find. But it was there, every time. Months later, when the war in Europe ended, the records would show thousands of Shermans fitted with some version of Kinney's fix. None of them carried his name. No medals, no speeches, just a note buried in an ordnance report. Improvised field cooling system, highly effective. Origin, Normandy. But for the men who'd been there on D-Day, for those who had watched their tanks burn, and then watched others live because of one man's crazy idea, the story didn't need to be written down. They remembered. Years later, long after the tanks were gone and the fields had healed, one of those men visited a museum where a Sherman sat on display. On its rear engine plate was a faint weld line, a curve of metal that didn't quite match the factory design. The veteran smiled, ran his hand across it, and said quietly, "Kinney's work." The crazy fix that had once seemed reckless had become part of history, invisible, uncredited, but essential. And somewhere in the hum of every engine that refused to quit, his idea still lived on.